Hello there and welcome to On the Case, and today I'm on the case of Dr. Robert Winston and his proposal to get cyclists to carry number plates on their bicycles. Now this is something I've been thinking, I planned to do probably best part of a year ago, but I've seen stuff again on Twitter today and it's just time to dispel some of those anti-cyclist myths and negative rhetoric. So, Winston has been critical of cyclists for years, to the point of using his power as a Labour peer to become a professional troll. He suggested cyclists shouldn't be allowed to use the road, said cyclists are everywhere, claims they are arrogant and jump red lights, and he's claimed, without evidence mind you, that the new segregated London's cycle lanes add to pollution because they take up valuable road space for motorists. And in the last few weeks, well actually it's not the last few weeks because this was written ages ago, he's now been claiming to have been abused and kicked for confronting a cyclist on the pavement. Well, let's go through some of these things. So his first one is cyclists shouldn't be allowed to use the road. Well, tough. Cyclists have been required by law to use the road since 1835. In fact, let me just give me a second because I should have prepared this beforehand. There it is. And that one. Okay, and let me swap. I think it's that one. Yes, it is. Okay, so if we look at the highway code here, so this is rule 64 here. You must not cycle on the pavement. I agree, you shouldn't. But if we look here, here's the Highways Act of 1835. That's the law that applies to cyclists. So cyclists have been required to use the road since 1835. That's 60 years before the car was invented. So, and like I say, we've got the law here because something to bear in mind, I'll mention this later, there are two types of rules. There are should rules and there are must rules. If we look, there's a should rule and there's a must rule. Must or must not. And so it's in capital letters and the law is underneath it. So when you've got all these ones, where, there we go, you must not, and there are rules to go with it. So, okay. So, that's the first part. So, cyclists are everywhere. Well, that implies that there are too many cyclists around. Why does he get to make that judgment? Isn't it interesting how he doesn't seem to say there are too many empty taxi cabs around, or there are too many cars around, etc. It's very easy to be critical of someone in the other group when you're not one of them. Sorry, Robert. Tough. He claims they're arrogant. Well, they're arrogant for declaring, hey, I'm a road user too. Why are you impinging on my right to use the road? I mean, the amount of times I've had someone, it's like, oh, how dare you tell me off for cutting too close and things like that. I'm arrogant for doing that, am I? I don't understand that. So he says he's claimed that segregated cycle lanes cause pollution. His claim is because the road has been narrowed, congestion increases. Vehicles are slowed and slow vehicles emit more pollutants. Well, we all know during any roadworks, traffic is slowed and slow-moving traffic increases pollution. So let's forget about that because that's a temporary problem. The reality is that Winston and the cabbie drivers who make this claim are dead wrong. Thanks to the success in Uber in London, private hire vehicles have gone up by 120% since 2005, from 49,000 to almost 87,500 today. Hackney cabs have gone up by 1% to 21,000. There are also 1,000 buses in London too, up by 1,000 since 2005. All of them adding to pollution. We can also add to that an increase in shopping, groceries, parcels being delivered within the city to your home, whether it's getting a large item like a new television brought to you from Currys or a similar retailer online, or DPD or UPS delivering parcels around, for companies and, just your own things. How about groceries being delivered from your door from Asda or Sainsbury's or some other supermarket instead of going there yourself? Or having a small parcel delivered by courier by someone using their own car, or, such as Hermes or Yodel. Add to that, chunks of London and most other cities, including Manchester where I live, they're getting new skyscrapers and apartment blocks and office blocks and industrial projects like Crossrail, all of them bringing lorry loads of material on a constant basis. Don't you think that all of those will add to the congestion and pollution? I do. In addition, Transport for London has shown that since the segregated cycle lanes have been installed, which, by the way, make up less than 4% of roads in London, in the first 2 weeks of opening, pollution had dropped slightly. Cycle traffic rose by 5% on those routes alone, and 46% of the road traffic was cyclists, taking up only 33% of the space. Traffic engineers will use the rule of thumb that a road can carry 2,000 cars per hour, or 14,000 bicycles. And leaving it till last, cyclists jump red lights. This is true, and they shouldn't do it. And for every cyclist that jumps a red light, it's an excuse for a motorist to vent their spleen, adding to how cyclists don't pay road tax, they don't pay insurance, or they don't have insurance, they illegally ride two-breast. It's not illegal. Riding on the pavement, riding in the middle of the road, overtaking at lights, holding up traffic, wear funny clothes, they think they're in the Tour de France, they don't use the cycle lanes, they don't wear high visibility vests, they don't wear helmets, they weave all over the road, etc, 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 in order to justify the idea that sharing the road is somehow a bad thing. Every single one of those are bogus arguments. But let me add a disclaimer. When I refer to motorists breaking rules, I'm talking about a minority of bad drivers that spoil it for all the considerate and good drivers. Exactly like the bad cyclists spoil it for the good cyclists. I'll just give you a simple example off the top of my head. If I ride to Manchester, I might have 1 or 2 people do something really, really stupid and dangerous. But in a ride to Manchester, 6.5 miles, I might encounter 2,000 to 3,000. That's a tiny minority. So let's go through the list. Yes, it's true. Cyclists don't pay road tax because it's an emissions tax, and cyclists don't have any emissions. Road tax, properly known as vehicle exercise duty, is nothing more than emissions tax. It has nothing to do with using the road. And there are 3 million motorists that don't pay VED. The same is true for electric cars emitting less than 50 grams of carbon dioxide per kilometre. Also, disabled drivers can get exemptions, tractors which run on red diesel, vintage cars older than 1973 I think it is, emergency vehicles, and diplomatic vehicles pays 0 too. Of course, you don't get many diplomatic vehicles in Manchester, but you certainly do in London. Are they suggesting that no electric cars are allowed to use the road either? If they change the rules so cyclists had to pay VED, they pay exactly the same amount as a zero emission vehicle, like an electric vehicle, £0 and 0 pence. Roads are paid for out of general taxation. Vehicle exercise duty collects £5 billion per year, which goes into a big pot of the Treasury like income tax and VAT. The Highways Agency, which covers the trunk roads and covers some trunk roads and the motorway network, which cyclists are not allowed to use, their annual budget is £6.5 billion per year. So if vehicle excise duty was specifically ring-fenced for motorway maintenance, for road maintenance, which it isn't, it wouldn't even cover the cost of the motorway network. What pays for road repairs is council tax, and cyclists and pedestrians pay for that. But a cyclist does pretty much zero damage to the road, unlike the masses of cars and vans, and especially HGVs and buses. So far from cyclists not paying their way, cyclists are subsidizing motoring. So the exact opposite is the case. If they want to get annoyed at people not paying their way, then worry about the estimated 2 million people who choose not to pay, or who can't afford insurance, or the banned drivers who have convictions for speeding or dangerous driving or drink driving. Those are the people that are really the danger on the road. So, cyclists don't have insurance. Well, that's true, but in reality, most cyclists do. Most formal cycling clubs and societies have insurance as a part of their club membership, but more than that, home insurance provides third-party coverage for bikes listed on the policy. But the biggest difference is that a bike literally can't write off a car. Even in the event of a collision where the cyclist was solely to blame, the cost of a scraped wing or a dented door is in the hundreds of pounds, not thousands, and certainly not in the tens of thousands of pounds. And like the road tax point I mentioned a moment ago, the drivers who choose not to pay or are banned, they have no insurance and they force up your premium, because if they hit your car, they can write it off. Riding two abreast. It's not illegal. As I mentioned before, there are two kinds of rules. There are should rules and must rules. Breaking must rules is illegal and the law is written underneath. Cyclists ride on pavements. Yes, it's true. Cyclists shouldn't ride on pavements, as I showed the rule a short while ago. But this is a cause and effect problem. The cause? Shitty drivers, tailgating, overtaking too close, performing a left hook, overtaking just to turn right in front of the cyclist, forcing them to brake hard, pulling out of junctions without looking, being parked and pulling away from a curb, suddenly changing lanes without using wing mirrors or indicating. These are the hazards that cyclists face every single day. The effect is cyclists on the pavement because they're too scared to be on the road. That's why the very segregated cycle lanes that Winston so despises are so important, because they keep cyclists away from cars, which makes them safe for us and therefore keeps cyclists off the pavements. Cyclists ride in the middle of the road and hold up traffic. Well, first things first, cyclists are traffic. Cyclists have as much Cyclists have as much right to use the road as anybody else. Don't like that? Well, either share the road or sell your car and get the bus. And besides which, it's not in the middle of the road, it's in the middle of the lane. The middle of the road is where those dotted lines are at the side. There's nothing in the Highway Code or the Road Traffic Act that says that cyclists must be near the curb. The nearest you have is a early part of the Road Traffic Act that says that we drive on the left in the UK. Not only is it necessary to ride in the centre of the lane sometimes, but it's vital. If the road is narrow and there's not enough room for a safe overtake, then being near the curb would leave a tempting gap that a driver could think, oh, I can just squeeze through there, placing their car inches away from their wing mirror and possibly even hitting a cyclist's elbow. Not good enough? There's a Department for Transport Think campaign which has a poster which illustrates you should just take the lane in narrow or busy roads. Another example is going through a pedestrian island. If I'm riding down the road and I'm approaching a pedestrian island, I make an assessment of whether there's enough room for me and an overtaken vehicle to be in the same space where I won't be able to touch their vehicle. If they couldn't be able to get through there without me being able to touch them and them driving through the island, then I reserve the right to take the lane through that obstacle, because I'm not going to let someone jeopardise my safety just to save them a handful of seconds. So in good time, I'll do a shoulder check, I'll give a nice strong indication, I'll move to the centre of the lane, and I will block the space until I'm on the other side, where I'll slide back towards the curb, and if I've held it up, I'll give them a wave to say thank you very much for your patience. Now, I don't care if you have a problem with it, because my safety is more important than anyone's time. If you have a problem with waiting for 4 or 5 seconds, I suggest you do 2 things. 1, leave home or work 1 minute earlier, just in case you come across loads of cyclists. And 2, change your shoes for ones with Velcro, because tying shoelaces is tiresomely slow and you obviously need every second of the day. Another simple example is on a left-hand bend. I've had too many instances where I'm going around a left-hand corner and an overtaking vehicle has drifted towards me on the apex of the curve when I'm right next to them. As a result, I'm going to go around that curve as I take a wider line so there's room to escape in case someone gets too close. And finally, cyclists should never ride in the door zone. You know that space where the parked cars could suddenly open a door on you without looking first? If I'm riding on the road, how am I supposed to know when that car parked up? Was it 2 days ago? Was it 2 hours ago? 2 minutes ago? Is that a head or a headrest? I don't know. If a driver opens a door into the path of a cyclist, not only is this illegal, it can be deadly. A car door has a corner to it, so in a collision, my head will go back, then forward, going straight underneath my helmet, guiding that corner right into my helmet. But I have a more likely scenario. I'm going to show you a video from Black Country Bike Cam from a few years ago. So let me just get that. Not that one. That one. That's already on the page. So that one. Yes, it is. Okay. So have a watch of this. Now, let's just watch that again, okay? But this time, imagine the camera is mounted in the windscreen of a tailgating van. Got to turn my volume on, sorry. So, if it was a van, that cyclist, would be dead. By the time the driver realises they've got to take action, they've already gone over the cyclist. That cyclist would be seriously injured or dead. So, cyclists overtake at lights. No, it's called filtering. It's perfectly legal. If it wasn't legal, it would be in the rules for cyclists, but no such rule exists. However, Rule 88 in the motorcycle section gives advice on filtering, and Rule 160 and 211 say watch for filtering cyclists and motorcyclists. Excuse me, I need a drink. So, cyclists wear funny clothes. So what? Some cyclists wear lycra. I don't. I went out today, I went like this. So, they think they're in the Tour de France. The average cruising speed for a normal mountain bike, just riding along, not really pushing very hard, that's about 8 to 12 miles per hour. Road bikes are faster, but even then, they cruise about 15 to 20. You can go a lot faster if you really push, but most people don't. But there's no pleasing some drivers. They'll complain when cyclists are holding up traffic, and then complain when they're going too fast. Not only that, how many times have you seen an idiot driver treating the road like their own personal racetrack? how often do we see cars doing 80 miles per hour on the motorway? But more than that, have a look at this. Let me just swap screens. And there. So here's some statistical data. This is on the RAC, so you can't sort of say that, oh, this is a cycling website. No, this is the RAC. Okay, 9 out of 10 drivers break speed limits in 20 mile per hour zones, and we can see here this is released from the Department for Transport. So new official figures show that speeding motorists are refusing to stick to 20 mile an hour limits, putting drivers, the elderly and others at risk. Data released by the Department for Transport found that a staggering 86% of all journeys made through 20 mile an hour zones last year broke the speed limit. Given the majority of these schools are in residential areas and around schools, this recklessness is endangering vulnerable pedestrians and other road users. Not only are the speed limits, slower speed limits being breached, with almost half, 48% of journeys on motorways made at over 70 miles an hour as a speed limit. Now, something to bear in mind here, the motorway has two kinds of traffic in, so to speak. The first one is cars. You see them going over 70 miles per hour. But where it says 48%, let's not forget that one of the types of traffic you see a lot of on the motorway is lorries. So lorries are limited to 60 or even 56. I can't remember what the number is exactly, but they are limited. They can't go faster than 70 miles an hour anyway. So if we think that, you know, the average there is going to be 48% going over the speed limit, when we start removing the lorries, most of the cars are going to be over that speed limit. And then there was the other one, which is in 30 mile per hour zones, 52% of journeys were breaking the speed limit, despite this being the threshold for most residential and urban areas. 34% of drivers guilty of tailgating, and just, you know, all sorts of other things. So, like I say, that's an example, a perfect example of, you know, it baffles me. So who's going too fast? I'll give you the hint. It's not the cyclists. So, they don't use cycle lanes, yes, and they don't have to. Let me just find it again in the highway code. Let me just swap over. So, if we go down, rules for cyclists, and it's rule 63, and if you look, it says cycle lanes, yada yada yada. Use of cycle lanes is not compulsory, but will depend on your experience and skills, but they can make your journey safer. Now, there are many instances where cycle lanes are just dreadful. And of course, this is assuming that these cycle lanes are going where you want them to go. So, but like I say, many cycle lanes are dreadful. They're little more than a bit of paint at the side of the road. If they're littered with detritus such as stones and sticks and glass and dirt because the council forget to clean them often enough, they have potholes and puddles and sunken drains in them. When I ride to Manchester, one section has a cycle lane in the door zone, so even if I'm in the middle of it, I can reach out and touch an overtaking tram. In fact, I have a picture of that. Where is it? Just waiting for it to open. There we go. It's a really bad picture because it's my old webcam, my old cycle camera, but you can see that if we consider the door is going to open to about here, and this I can touch, you know, you couldn't get a car between there and there. So If I'm staying out the door zone, I can touch a tram. I worry about this bit of road because, you know, one day, might be me, but it probably won't be, some cyclists be going down here, someone just flings the door open and a tram is just about to overtake at the same time. It's got catastrophe written all over it. So, you know. The next one is, let me just change, I need to change back. Okay, so they don't wear helmets, and they don't have to. This is a bone of contention for a lot of people. On one side, you've got the medical professionals advising people to wear helmets because it could possibly save their life. On the other hand, you have other people who look at the bigger picture. Yes, it's possible that a helmet could prevent a serious injury, but cycle helmets are only designed for a 12-mile-per-hour impact. They're not a crash helmet. The kind of protection they offer is hitting the brakes a bit hard and going over the handlebars, or losing balance and falling sideways. They're not going to do much against a 30-mile-per-hour impact with a car, and they will not prevent a cyclist from crush injuries, blunt force trauma, breaking your back or your neck. In addition, when Australia introduced mandatory cycle helmet use, cyclist deaths increased. The reason, it turns out, is that when drivers approach a cyclist, they'll take more risks with their safety, overtaking closely or left hooking, because they think, well, if I misjudge it, at least they're wearing a helmet, so they'll be okay. Another part of the study, which was that a male tester wore a woman's wig and discovered that drivers give more space to women than they do for men. On a personal level, I suppose that's one advantage of being trans and living as a woman, huh? But more seriously, this obsession about helmet use is just a way to absolve the responsibility from the driver and place it with the cyclist instead. As if it's the cyclist's responsibility to armour themselves against the carelessness of the driver. Well, let's put that into perspective. The amount of times there's been a newspaper story about a collision in a car and a cyclist, of course it's hardly ever reported as a collision between a motorist and a cyclist, because obviously cars drive themselves, right? Maybe they're starting to, probably more safe than the drivers that are supposedly driving themselves. So in the story, the driver was at fault, but the cyclist wasn't wearing a helmet. And people will say, well, the cyclist deserved it because it was their fault for not wearing a helmet. Well, let's swap a couple of words here. So if a woman gets raped and it turns out she wasn't wearing trousers, she was wearing a skirt, do you say, oh, well, she deserved it then because it was her fault because she should have been wearing trousers? The driver was the one that wasn't paying attention, or was on the phone, or cut the corner, and yet somehow, again, it's the cyclist's responsibility to armour themselves against the driver's actions. How does that work? Now let's go to Amsterdam. You look at videos there, no one's wearing a helmet. They don't need them, because they don't need to armour themselves against drivers, and the reason is really simple. In the Netherlands, most drivers are also cyclists. As such, they empathise with them because they know how it would feel to be overtaken closely or tailgated. So, next one. They don't wear high-vis gear. Again, it's not compulsory, and it doesn't bloody work. Here's a photo of an ambulance covered in high-vis, and a car crashed into it. Here's a picture of a police car that was smashed into by a driver that wasn't paying attention, despite the high-vis, and had its lights flashing when it occurred. Or how about this one? A shop with 500 high-vis jackets in the window. If drivers can't see an ambulance, a police car with flashing lights, or in a building, what chance has a smaller cyclist got by comparison? I've worn a bright yellow jacket, and cars have pulled out onto a roundabout that I'm on, or pulled out of a junction without looking properly. But again, somehow it's the cyclist's responsibility to make sure they're seen by unobservant motorists, not the motorists who have the responsibility to look out for all drivers, not just other motorists. They weave all over the road. Yes, sometimes they do. You'll get some wobbling going up a hill or starting away from traffic lights because it's harder to balance when you're going slowly. So you get a little bit of wobble, and then once you get speed going, it gets, it's easier. But you'll also get weaving going on, other sorts of weaving going on as well. That's because they're avoiding sunken drains, potholes, uneven road surfaces, puddles, litter, glass, and other detritus, wet drains, wet paint after the rain, or maybe even spilt diesel. These are all good reasons for cyclists to weave, and an even better reason to give them more room, not less. But let's get back to red lights, a topic at hand. Interestingly though, on-street surveys have showed that per capita, motorists jump red lights at a far higher rate than cyclists do. This is probably down to the fact that cyclists take longer to get across the junction than a car does, and are more vulnerable in the event of a collision. In short, without crumble zones and airbags, mortal fear dominates their decisions. Now, I've been riding on the road for more than 25 years, and I can say that I've seen more motorists jump red lights than I've ever seen cyclists. And I don't mean cyclists jumping red lights, I mean all the cyclists I've ever seen in my entire life. And that's not hyperbole either. I live next to a main road, and at certain times during the peak, I see 1 to 3 motorists jump the red lights, and many more leaving it very late on the amber, despite the highway codes having a must rule saying that you should stop on amber unless it would be dangerous to do so. Myself and a number of cyclists I follow on Twitter or YouTube have had incidents where they felt forced to push through an amber light that they would normally stop at, but they couldn't do because there was a tailgated car behind them that didn't show any signs of stopping. So they're afraid of being smashed into from behind by a driver that was an amber gambler and wouldn't stop. Think about that door zone I showed you earlier. But back to Winston. I'm going to read out a section in The Guardian. So it says, Professor Robert Winston, the Labour peer and fertility specialist, has called for cyclists to be required to have number plates after he was claimed he was kicked and abused after challenging a woman not to ride on the pavement. In a letter to The Times, he said he encountered the cyclist on Wednesday riding on the pavement in Bloomsbury, central London. He was helped by fellow pedestrians while the cyclist rode off. He identified her as being clearly well educated and in her late 30s or early 40s, but said he had not reported the incident to the police because it would be impossible to identify her. After he pointed out that she was breaking the law, the woman became abusive and grabbed my phone and attempted to damage it, but she subsequently assaulted me by repeatedly kicking, he said. Let me just take a little drink. So, let's just assume for a moment that this story is true, and since he never provides any evidence for any of his other claims either. But notice a few things in this story. In what way does he challenge this cyclist? He doesn't say. We don't know whether he politely said, "Excuse me, miss, you really shouldn't be riding on the pavement." We don't know whether he deliberately stepped in front of her or grabbed the handlebars to accost her with an angry frown on her face. And notice how it's a female cyclist. Think about it seriously. If someone was polite with you, would you go into the kind of rage he's claiming? How about if you're a woman being accosted by some strange man you'd never met before? Wouldn't her natural instinct to be fight or flight? London is chock-a-block of CCTV. Wouldn't a CCTV operator see this and call the police? Or wouldn't be able to use to make this a formal complaint? Those members of the public, wouldn't they offer to back up his story? Could this be a fake incident so he can get some free publicity in addition to asking questions in the House of Lords last month? I say last month, this was ages ago now. I mean, am I the only one here that's getting a whiff of someone pulling a Jussie Smollett here? But you know what? For argument's sake, let's take it at face value and examine whether it's worth putting number plates on bicycle. In simple terms, it's not. Let's forget that every single town and city on the planet that has ever tried this has given it up after a few years. What we need to do is a cost-benefit analysis. In order to link cyclists with their bikes, they're going to have to register them all. So that's 25 million cyclists across the UK. Some ride daily, others a few days a week. Some weekly, monthly, a few days a year, yearly, or the few that just end up buying a bike and leaving it in the shed when they decided to get fit, but like so many, they gave it up after a few weeks later. Maybe because they were scared off the road, who knows. So we have 25 million new entries into the DVLA database, because they're on the bike, yeah? So 25 million people, which will need to be, we have 25 new entries to the DVLA database. That's a drivers, Department of Vehicle Licensing Authority, I think it is. I can't remember now. Anyway, so they'll need to be changed to include a new set of road users. Well, bear in mind, there are only 37.3 million motorists in the UK right now. So, that's a 67% increase in the workload for the DVLA overnight. Well, that's an initial big cost, but once it's done, it's just regular day-to-day processing that needs to be done. How many people start riding each year? And I suppose, how many people die too? And then we have the big change. Every year, 2.5 million bikes are sold every year, so they'll need to be registered. But guess what? That 2.5 million figure is the same as the number of cars sold in the UK. So we've doubled the workload for the DVLA right there. Then the DVLA will need to process how many bikes are reported stolen each year. After all, if someone breaks the law on the bike, the proper owner doesn't want to get into trouble, so they'll want to report it, of course. Well, currently, 89,000 motor vehicles are stolen in the UK each year. But that's dwarfed by the number of 376,000 bicycles stolen. That's 4.2 times the number of vehicles stolen. So instead of 189,000 vehicles stolen, that's got to be accounted for the DVLA database, we're now looking at 465 DVLA alterations per year, which will be followed by people phoning up to say they've replaced their bike and they need to register it. The DVLA don't work for free. In order to double the amount of new vehicles entered into the database each year, plus the amount stolen, well, we've gone from 2,589,000 entries to 5,554,000 entries. That's a 114% increase in workload for the DVLA. So in order to do this, we're going to have to more than double the funding for the DVLA. Double it. That doubles the amount of that doubles the accounts for the amount of extra employees that needs to process the data, double the pensions, bigger computer servers. They may even need to get a new building to fit all those new staff in there. The list goes on. Currently, it costs £451 million in operating costs for the DVLA per year. Doubling it passes more than 900 million. Who's going to pay for that? Motorists? The government out of our taxes? Or cyclists? Well, if it's the latter, we're going to have a problem. Every single cyclist that decides that the rigmarole of administration just isn't worth it and decided to stay in their car is another motorist adding to the congestion, adding to the pollution. More people will be dying from illnesses caused by those toxic gases. More people will die due to illnesses related to sedentary lifestyles at a time when we already have an obesity problem. So that's more cost for an already overstressed NHS budget. More long-term illness requiring medication, just because some people don't like the idea of sharing the road. Oh, I've lost the page. So that's what it all comes down to at the end. I rest my case. Thank you for watching.